In the previous lecture, we discussed how the budget deficits are linked with trade deficit through the demand and supply of financial capital. In this lecture, we'll be talking about the twin deficits. Now, question is, what is a twin deficit? So first, let's define what is this twin deficit means. So according to twin deficit hypothesis, it's an observation that there is a strong causal link between a nation's government budget balance, that is budget deficit or surplus, and its current account balance, which is trade deficit or surplus. That means budget deficit and trade deficit are closely interconnected. So which essentially means that only way that domestic investment can exceed domestic saving is if capital is flowing into a country from abroad, which essentially means that if we don't have enough money, that means we want our investment to go up and we don't save enough, from where that extra money is going to come, and that extra money is obviously going to come from abroad. And this is well articulated in this demand and supply of financial capital equation that we did in the last lecture video. So let's take a case of the trade deficit. Okay, again, trade deficit means a situation where your imports are more than your export. So we can rewrite this whole equation here into this, which essentially means that this is your trade deficit is equal to your private investments minus private savings plus this is your budget deficit. And we all know private domestic investment is nothing but private domestic savings. So this is always same, it is equal. So essentially, which means that any trade deficit must be equal to your budget deficit or vice versa. Now, which essentially means that if our government wants to run huge budget deficits, by definition, they have to run huge trade deficit as well. And this is the twin deficit hypothesis. That means both needs to go together, budget deficit and trade deficit. So when President Trump talks about that he wants to decrease the trade deficit, he also needs to decrease the budget deficit, but which didn't happen. Rather, our budget deficit is going up, and also because of the coronavirus thing, now is going to hit another couple of $1 trillion. So essentially, that extra money, from where it's going to come? Obviously, we have to rely on foreign investors to lend us money so that you can use that money to fill up our budget deficit. Other option for Fed is to print more dollar bills, but moment Fed prints more dollar bills, that can lead to runaway inflation. Now let's try to discuss the same thing using a trade surplus. So trade surplus is a situation where we have more exports than imports. So which means that lower trade deficit. Again, that whole demand and supply of financial capital can be rewritten as this. This is your trade surplus and this is your budget surplus. So if we run a trade surplus, that can translate into budget surplus and vice versa. So in this case, if domestic saving or private or public is higher than domestic investment, the extra money or financial capital will be invested abroad. That means if you have extra money as a result of private or government savings, that money can go abroad in terms of US investment outside this country. So let's try to understand all this trade balance and budget deficit a little bit more using this graph, using this figure. So for example, if domestic investment goes up and there's no change in private savings and there's no change in government savings, that means T minus G, by definition your trade deficit has to go up. Okay, so if domestic investment goes up, trade deficit has to go up, assuming there's no change in private savings and no change in government savings. If domestic savings goes up and domestic investment doesn't change, or public investment doesn't change, which essentially means that your trade deficit has to fall. And finally, if public savings decreases, which essentially means that government is spending more, that's how, and which essentially means that government is spending more with no corresponding change in domestic investment and no change in savings, which essentially means that trade deficit has to go up. So the important point you have to understand here is this: the budget deficits or trade deficits are interlinked. You cannot have one going down without the other going down as well. So if US government keep on spending more money, they will be needing more money, and only way they can get those money if we run a huge trade deficit as well. Because by running huge trade deficit, what's happening, foreigners are getting more and more dollar bills, and now they can lend those dollar bills to us so that we can make investment or we can run our government. And that's the fallacy of twin deficits.